Welcome to our New Testament survey series. My name is Stephen Clybourne, and I'm leading us through the New Testament. In fact, today we are in session 13 and will conclude the first part of our New Testament survey. If you're following along with us in real time, then this is the season of Lent. And I've timed these lessons to correspond to the season of Lent and the season of Easter. So after today's session, we will take a break for Easter, and then following Easter, we will begin part 2 of our New Testament survey course, which will focus on the early church. But part 1 is focusing on Jesus himself as portrayed in the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have surveyed all 4 of those Gospels and have in previous sessions and have discovered the distinctive qualities of each of those portraits of Jesus. We have talked about the teachings of Jesus in general and the miracles of Jesus, or the signs of Jesus as they're called in John's Gospel. And today we conclude this part 1 of our New Testament survey series as we focus on the passion narratives, the passion of Jesus leading up to this season of Easter. As I said, my name is Stephen Clybourne, and I am the senior pastor of Earl Street Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina. You can follow along on our Bible survey series on our website, which is esbcgreenville.org. You can see all of the previous videos. We started with the Old Testament survey, and all those videos are there. And then the first 12 sessions of our New Testament survey. And today you can also find the study guide on our website. And today we're going to be looking at session 13. As I said, the final session in part 1 of the New Testament survey series. And today our focus is going to be on the passion narratives. So let's talk a little bit about what the terms or the words mean when we talk about the passion of Jesus. First of all, when we talk about the passion of Jesus, we're talking about his suffering and death. So when you use the word passion regarding Jesus, you're talking about his suffering and death. When we talk about the passion narrative, singular, we're talking about that body of material that was collected prior to, compiled and collected prior to the writing of the 4 Gospels. Now, if you go way back in your memory to the introduction to the New Testament, you might remember that I said the stories of Jesus circulated orally for a period of time. And then those who were followers of Jesus thought it was important to start to write down the stories of Jesus and to put those stories together. And one of the first collections of stories about Jesus is this collection of stories called the Passion Narrative. And what we will see as we move through the 4 Gospels is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all make use of this passion narrative. So a lot of this is going to be verbatim across the 4 Gospels. But then as we have seen throughout our New Testament survey, each of the 4 Gospel writers also gives his own distinctive contribution to the passion narrative. But the passion narrative, singular, is a way of referring to the collection of traditions about the suffering and death of Jesus. When we talk about passion narratives, plural, we're talking about each of the four distinctive versions of the singular passion narrative. So what we're going to see is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John take this passion narrative as they received it, and then added to it and retold the passion narrative from their own inspired point of view. The word passion comes from the word pathos or pathos in the Greek language, which really means the depth of feeling. And so it's talking about, again, the suffering, the suffering of Jesus. Now, when we talk about the passion narratives, or the passion narrative singular, we are talking about major events that are reported by all four of the Gospels. The Last Supper, the arrest of Jesus on the Mount of Olives, the trials of Jesus before the high priests and the Roman procurator, the denials of Peter, the crucifixion itself, and the discovery of the empty grave. So all four of the Gospels contain their own versions of these six events, which form the essence of the passion narrative. What we're going to do in this session is look at the distinctive way that each of the four Gospels take these six events and the passion narrative that they received and how they interpreted it, and in some cases added to it, and told the version of the passion narrative based on their distinctive purposes for writing their gospel. So we're going to begin with the first of the four Gospels to have been written, the Gospel of Mark. Now, when we look at the passion narrative in the Gospel of Mark, we're really talking about two chapters only. Now, as we have seen, Mark's Gospel was believed to have been the first of the Gospels to have been written, and one of the reasons we believe it was the first is because it was the shortest. So as we look at chapter 14, verses 1 through 11, as Mark begins his passion narrative, we see the plot to destroy Jesus. If you look at chapter 14, verses 1 through 2, Mark sets the stage for the passion narrative by saying, "It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be a tumult of the people.'" Do you see the bitter irony in that statement? So the chief priests and scribes were plotting to kill their Messiah, not recognizing that Jesus was the Messiah. They were plotting to put him to death, to kill him. But they, out of respect for the Passover, they wanted to wait until the Passover was over and then kill him. And that bitter irony is played out in the Gospel of Mark and in the other Gospels as well. And we will point out some of the ways that that ironic element surfaces in this passion narrative. This plot to destroy Jesus was followed by an accounting of the anointing of Jesus for death prior to his death. Look at chapter 14, verses 3 through 9. And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at a table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. But there were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was the ointment thus wasted? For this ointment might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they reproached her for this wasteful act of extravagance. Verse 6, but Jesus said, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you will, you can do good to them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burying. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Here there is a foreshadowing of the death of Jesus. And Jesus says, by this woman unnamed in Mark, who by her extravagant act, she was actually unwittingly anointing Jesus for his death. So we already see this foreshadowing. So not only are the chief priests and scribes plotting to kill Jesus, but Jesus is anticipating his own death. And then we see Mark's account of the betrayal of Judas, verses 10 and 11. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And so he sought an opportunity to betray him. Now notice that a lot of the details that we're familiar with regarding this passion narrative are not given to us by Mark. Mark gives us a shorter version with fewer details, and some of the other gospel writers will fill in some of the details. But at this point, Mark just introduces Judas Iscariot as the betrayer. Then in chapter 14, verses 12 through 25, we see Mark's version of the Last Supper. We will not read this entire passage, but you will see in verse 12 that that it took place on the first day of unleavened bread when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, which is going to have a lot of symbolic importance in the story of Jesus's crucifixion. Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? And so Jesus sent two of his disciples and said to them, go into the city, and then gave them specific instructions to prepare for the meal. And then in verses 17 through 21, we see Mark's version of Jesus's prediction of his betrayer. When it was evening, this is verses 17 through 21. When it was evening, he came with the 12, and as they were at the table eating, Jesus said, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. And they began to be sorrowful and to say to him one after the other, is it I? He said to them, it is one of the 12 who's dipping bread into the dish with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. We're going to talk some about the plan of God and the act of Judas and the role of Satan in this ominous story. But here Jesus predicts his own betrayer. And then there is Mark's account, a very brief account of what we would now call the Lord's Supper, of what some traditions call the Eucharist. And as they were eating, he took bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them and said, take, this is my body. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, and that word Eucharist comes from this phrase, giving thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I shall not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. following the Last Supper, Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, and Mark gives a rather lengthy description of the events at the Mount of Olives. First, Jesus gives 3 prophecies in verses 26 through 31. First, Jesus predicts in chapter 14, verse 27, that all the disciples will fall away, that in the end, he will die alone. They will have abandoned him, deserted him. Then in verse 28, Jesus promises them that even though they would fail him, he would not fail them. And their failure does not separate them from him. These are really important and comforting and reassuring words of Jesus, that even when we fail him, he comes back to us and he does not fail us. And then Jesus predicts in chapter 14, verse 30, that Peter will deny Jesus. And if you look at that, you see Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." But he said vehemently, "If I must die with you, I will not deny you." Of course, those became famous last words, and they all promised the same. Peter could not imagine an occasion when he would deny knowing Jesus, and yet before the cock would crow that night, he would have denied Jesus 3 times. Then in chapter 14, I'm sorry, I lost my place. In chapter 14, verses 32 through 42, Jesus prayed at the Garden of Gethsemane. And I want you to notice how Mark tells this story in a very dramatic way. When they went to the place which was called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray," he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible to thee. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what thou wilt." And he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation." Notice how Mark portrays this agonizing prayer of Jesus. And remember that Mark, more than any of the other gospel writers, wants us to see the real humanity of Jesus. So Jesus prays. He told the disciples to watch and pray. They did neither. And then following that, Jesus was arrested and the disciples fled. Judas came and betrayed Jesus. And then there is that dark, ominous verse in chapter 50, "And they all forsook him and fled." As soon as Jesus was arrested, the disciples scattered and were no longer there with him. In chapter 14, verses 53 through 72, we see the trial of Jesus and Peter's denials of Jesus. First, the handing over of Jesus to the religious leaders in chapter 14, verses 53 and 54. Notice that this so-called trial, and it really was a mockery of a trial, but it began with the religious leaders. The Jews were given, as you might remember, a certain measure of freedom to settle their own religious disputes without involving the government. And so there was the handing over of Jesus to the religious leaders. And then the so-called trial that began in verse 55 among the chief priests and the whole council. And then Peter's denials in the last verses of chapter 14. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. In chapter 15, verses 1 through 20, the first part of verse 20, Jesus was handed over to the Romans. So once the religious leaders had tried him, then if they wanted him to be crucified, that had to be ordered by the Roman government. So the religious leaders then turned the matter over to the Roman leaders. Of course, crucifixion was a penalty reserved for criminals and runaway slaves and political insurgents. And so the fact that Jesus was crucified with the charge posted above his head that he was the king of the Jews indicates that the Romans regarded Jesus as a political insurgent who was a threat to the stability of the region and a threat to their authority, or at least that was their trumped up charge. They had to have justification for putting Jesus to death. And so this period of time was divided into periods of 3 hours. The religious leaders delivered Jesus to Pilate at 6 a.m. The Romans crucified Jesus at 9 a.m. At noon, there was darkness over the whole land until 3 p.m. And then Jesus died. So notice those divisions of time in 3 hour increments. Jesus was delivered or handed over to Pilate in the first 5 verses. And then there was the release of Barabbas, where there was a choice between Jesus being freed or Barabbas being freed. And of course, Barabbas was freed. And then the mockery that took place in chapter 15, verses 16 through 20. And they began to mock Jesus as King of the Jews and stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. Then there is the brutal account of the crucifixion and death of Jesus. These verses form the heart of the Passion story in all of the Gospels. And of course, in the background of these verses is Psalm 22. It's almost like you need to read Mark's Gospel and Psalm 22 side by side. When we have our Good Friday service, Tenebrae service on Good Friday night, we always read parallel passages from the Old Testament and the New Testament, and several of our readings are from Psalm 22. When the church sought to understand the meaning of Jesus's death, the church went to the Psalms and started rereading the Psalms in the light of what they had witnessed in Jesus's crucifixion. And there, in the person of this righteous sufferer who was so often the subject of the Psalms, the church found a model by which to interpret the events of the Passion. So the crucifixion is recorded in verses 20 through 27, the mockery in verses 29 through 32, and then in verses 33 through 39, the death of Jesus. At the conclusion of the darkness, Jesus cried out the opening words of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is the only saying from the cross recorded by Mark. And it fits with Mark's portrait of Jesus, focusing on his humanity. One of his chosen disciples had betrayed him. Peter had denied him. All the rest of the disciples had fled. false witnesses had risen against him. The Sanhedrin had condemned him. The Gentiles, as well as his own people, had mocked him. Jesus stood alone because everyone had forsaken him. And then in the depth of his abandonment, he even experiences the absence of his Father. Of course, the irony of the death of Jesus is the reference to the curtain of the temple being torn in two. Jesus was accused of wanting to destroy the temple, so they put him to death. But it was actually his death which made the old temple obsolete. And the veil of the temple being torn in two is symbolic of that. In chapter 15, verses 40 through 47, we see the women going to bury the body of Jesus. Notice the prominence of women when the men, the disciples, the 12, had forsaken him. The women still had the courage to stick with him. And then in Mark's gospel, there are the resurrection there is Mark's account of the resurrection of Jesus, and also the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus in chapter 16. We see the first Easter, Mark's version of the first Easter morning when the Sabbath was passed. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And then the traditional close of the Gospel of Mark is chapter 16, verses 9 through 18. This is Mark's version of the what we would call the Great Commission. We like to quote the Great Commission from the Gospel of Matthew, and there's probably a reason for that. In Mark's version of the Great Commission, Jesus says, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover." We usually don't quote that version of the New Testament because we don't know what to do with those verses. And then in chapter 16, verses 19 through 20, we see the ascension of Jesus and the exaltation of Jesus. So in this section, Jesus is raised from the dead and then appears to witnesses of his resurrection. And so the Gospel of Mark ends with that. And as you might remember, when we went through the Gospel of Mark, there are alternate endings to the Gospel of Mark, and it's hard to know where the gospel actually ends, because there were apparently additions to the ending of Mark's gospel that we discussed when we went through that gospel. Now, we're not going to go into as much detail in the others because there's so much similarity, as we've seen, especially among the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There is often verbatim similarities. So we're going to look at the Passion according to Matthew, which takes place in chapters 26 and 27. As I said, every episode in Mark's Passion narrative is also found in Matthew's Passion narrative. So Matthew includes everything that Mark includes. And the amount of non-Markan material in Matthew accounts to approximately 26 verses. So why study Matthew's account of the Passion narrative? I mean, why not just look at Mark? The answer is because the Passion story receives a new context in Matthew's gospel. And so if you do remember or can review the distinctive qualities of Matthew's gospel, then you realize that by the time we get to the Passion narrative in Matthew's gospel, the story of Jesus's passion receives a new context. So there is the prelude to the passion in the first 16 verses of chapter 26, the plot that we've talked about already from Mark, the anointing for burial in chapter 26, verses 6 through 13 that we've already talked about, Judas's betrayal in verses 14 through 16 that we've already talked about. Then there is the Passover supper that we've already talked about, the preparations, the betrayer foretold, the Eucharist, the account of the Mount of Olives, Peter's denial predicted, Jesus in Gethsemane, and Jesus's arrest. The trial before the Sanhedrin, there was the Jewish trial, as we've already discussed, the ridiculed Messiah, and Peter's denial. The trial before Pilate, this section exposes some of Matthew's most conspicuous editorial work. When you look at chapter 27, you see some of the differences in Matthew, more differences in Matthew when you get to this section. The word blood is a theme that ties the events together in this section. Jesus is delivered to Pilate. And then Matthew gives us an account of Judas's death. I'm trying to find that verse. So they took counsel, this is verse 7, and bought with the 30 pieces of silver the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Notice again that theme of blood. But in verse 5, Matthew tells us that Judas hanged himself, throwing the pieces of silver in the temple, and he departed and hanged himself. And then Jesus appears before Pilate in that famous exchange, verses 11 through 26. And then Matthew's version of the crucifixion itself, the first mockery, the crucifixion. And in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is offered wine mingled with gall rather than myrrh, as in Mark, probably to make a clearer reference to Psalm 69:21. Remember, it is important for Matthew to make those connections with the Old Testament, thereby fulfilling the prophecy in Psalm 22:18, a psalm to which Matthew alludes often. So look for those Old Testament allusions and references in Matthew's gospel, because Matthew's portrait of Jesus is told in such a way, or presented in such a way, that Jewish people would see how Jesus fulfilled the role of Messiah. Then there was the second mockery in verses 39 through 44. And then the actual death of Jesus and the burial of Jesus. Matthew adds to the list of miraculous events which surround Jesus's death. I want us to look at some of these because this is another way that Matthew gives us a distinctive version of the Passion narrative. Matthew not only gives us a list of miraculous events which surrounds Jesus's death, but mentions others who confess Jesus as the Son of God, abbreviates the story of Joseph of Arimathea, and reveals that the chief priests and Pharisees made sure that Jesus's tomb was guarded. But the most significant addition to the story of Matthew's account of the dead, Matthew's account is the dead being raised, which seems to be Matthew's way of offering a foretaste of God's power, which will raise Jesus from the dead on the third day. Let's look at some of those distinctive elements in Matthew's gospel, beginning with verse 45. Notice that he follows the 3-hour increments that Mark offered us. Now, from the 6th hour, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? That is a direct quote from Psalm 22:1. Mark gave us that quotation as well. And some of the bystanders hearing it said, this man is calling Elijah, but Eli, Eli, that means my God. And Elijah means Yahweh is my God. So when Jesus was calling out Eli, some thought that he was calling out for Elijah. And one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with vinegar, and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. But the other said, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And then Matthew gives us the version of the temple curtain being torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split. And here's one of the distinctive contributions of Matthew's passion narrative. The tombs were also open. This is at the death of Jesus. The tombs were open, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep or who had died were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city of Jerusalem and appeared to many. So all these dead men walking, so to speak, after the death of Jesus. And then when the centurion and those who were with him keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and then saw all these miraculous, strange events taking place, they were filled with awe and said, truly, this was the Son of God. Remember, in Mark's gospel, only the centurion, but in Matthew's gospel, it's the centurion and others. So the death and burial of Jesus in Matthew's gospel seems to foreshadow a new age. The death of Jesus is a foreshadowing of the resurrection of Jesus when all these dead bodies started being raised. And Matthew calls Joseph of Arimathea a disciple of Jesus. Even though the 12 deserted him, there were disciples who did not. Joseph of Arimathea is called a disciple even though he wasn't one of the 12, and he did not desert Jesus. Matthew added dignity to Jesus's burial by adding the details of a clean burial cloth and a new tomb. These also are distinctive contributions of Matthew's gospel. And then Matthew also gives us this detail that there were guards at the tomb. This entire section is distinctive to Matthew and probably was included for a so-called apologetic purpose, not apologetic in the way you might think of the word apologetic, but as a way of proving that Jesus's body was not stolen because there were guards watching the tomb. Because the Jews themselves set a guard for the tomb. And then Matthew gives us his account of the resurrection in chapter 28, verses 1 through 20. And you'll notice that in Matthew's account, the women were Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. And then Matthew concludes after Jesus, after the first Easter, and Jesus appears, the risen Jesus appears, then he takes the 11 disciples remaining, Judas has already hanged himself, and gives them what we now call the Great Commission, the version of the Great Commission that we quote, go as you go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and lo, I'm with you always to the close of the age. Matthew's gospel ends on this glorious note of commissioning the disciples now to go and make disciples everywhere of all nations. Let's look at the passion narrative of Luke, and we're going to again speed through a lot of Luke's version because there is so much similarity. Luke presents the passion story of Jesus more as a martyrdom and includes details that portrays the death of Jesus in that way. But his passion narrative is more than a martyrdom. Jesus undergoes the passion according to God's will. It's his destiny, not just his death, but also his life was a model for would-be disciples. So even though Jesus is presented as a martyr, he was more than a martyr in Luke's gospel, who died a noble death for a cause. In the way that Luke tells the story of Jesus's passion, Luke makes it clear that Jesus died not just as a martyr, but he died as a prophet and a savior and a king and a Messiah. He died as the very Son of God. Luke's passion narrative differs from Mark's passion narrative in three important ways. First, Luke does not contain all the incidents reported in Mark. Second, Luke presents new material not found in Mark. And third, Luke has a different arrangement of several important events. So scholars have debated whether these differences imply that Luke used another source in addition to Mark as he wrote his passion narrative, but others simply conclude that the differences can be accounted for by Luke's editorial activity, style, or theological purpose, all of which would have been inspired by God all the same. So Luke's passion narrative begins as Matthew and Mark's with the plot to destroy Jesus, but the plotting in Luke occurs just before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which by this time was regarded almost as a continuation of the Passover celebration. And the chief participants in the plot were chief priests, scribes, Judas, and Satan. Notice the inclusion of Judas and Satan into the plot itself. And then let's look at how Luke does this in chapter 22. Verses 1 through 6. After the plot in verses 1 and 2, which is similar to what Matthew and Mark reported. Verse 3, then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. And notice how Luke brings Satan into the story at this point, into the plot of the story, and the plot to destroy Jesus, and also introduces Judas as a part of the plot to destroy Jesus. So Luke introduces Judas into the narrative sooner than Matthew and Mark. And then Luke gives us his account of the Last Supper in verses 7 through 38. There were preparations for the meal, as in Matthew and Mark, but Luke seems intent on showing the connection between the Eucharist, the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, the New Covenant meal, and the Passover, which was the Old Covenant meal. This section, like Matthew's account, underscores Jesus's prophetic foreknowledge of the events that were taking place. So when Luke tells the story, it's very clear that these events are not catching Jesus by surprise. The only difference is that in Luke, Jesus takes the initiative in arranging for the final meal with his disciples. Jesus takes the initiative. Then there is the supper itself, and then Jesus's farewell discourse, farewell talk with his disciples. And not only does this meal provide an occasion for the institution of what we now call the Lord's Supper, but in Luke, it also provides the setting for Jesus's farewell discussion, conversation with his disciples, which resembles some of the so-called farewell testaments in the Old Testament. And also in the intertestamental period. Then there is the account at the Mount of Olives. Luke, as Matthew and Mark, shows Jesus at prayer, and then Jesus's arrest. And then in verses 54 through 71 of chapter 22, the denial, excuse me, the denials of Peter, the mockery, and the trial. Now in Luke, the sequence and details of the events are different from Mark. Peter's denial, followed by the mockery, and followed by the so-called trial. Then Jesus appears before Pilate and Herod, and at this point in the Passion narratives, there are differences between and among all 4 of the Gospels. In Luke, the Roman soldiers do not mock Jesus as the King of the Jews. In Luke, Jesus is not bound as in Mark. Pilate's statement of Jesus's innocence is peculiar to Luke, and it's followed by 2 more declarations of Jesus's innocence. So these are some of the reasons why New Testament interpreters look at the Gospel of Luke and say that Luke tells the story of Jesus's passion, portraying Jesus as a martyr and insisting and making clear that Jesus was innocent of the charges directed toward him. And Pilate declared Jesus innocent. But of course, that does not lessen but his burden in the matter. It increases his burden. So Pilate admits Jesus is innocent and still goes along with the plot to kill him. And Luke is the only writer to tell us about an encounter between Jesus and Herod in chapter 13. So Luke is the only one who brings Herod into the Passion narrative. Luke develops the story about Barabbas, the least of all the gospel writers, doesn't make very much of the story about Barabbas. And in Luke, after Jesus appears before Herod, Pilate, quote, delivered up Jesus to the will of the people rather than formally pronouncing a sentence upon him. So Pilate kind of washes his hands of it and basically says, okay, says to the masses, the crowd, the people, you do what you think is right. Then we have in chapter 23, verses 26 through 49, Luke's version of the crucifixion and death of Jesus. Simon of Cyrene is mentioned in chapter 23, verse 26. And as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene who was coming in from the country and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. A beautiful picture of discipleship where Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me. Simon actually took up the cross of Jesus and followed him. The women of Jerusalem in verses 27 through 31. Only Luke gives us this story of women who were grieving over what was happening to Jesus. And that is because, if you remember, Luke's version of the gospel of Jesus focuses more on the role of women than any of the other gospels. The 2 criminals in verses 32 through 33, Luke reports that 2 criminals, one on Jesus's right side and one on his left, were crucified with him. And then Jesus's prayer in verse 34, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And then the mockery that Luke describes in verses 35 through 43. There were three levels of society that participated in the mockery of Jesus. There were the rulers, there were the soldiers, the criminal, and then the people in general. These mockeries are reminiscent of the opening scenes of Jesus's ministry. And then Luke's actual account of Jesus's death, verses 44 through 49 of chapter 23. The burial of Jesus is described in verses 50 through 56, and then the resurrection of Jesus, and then his post-resurrection appearances are described in chapter 24. Luke's version of the first Easter, on the first day of the week at early dawn, they went to the tomb taking spices. And in verse 10, he says that it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women. You'll notice that all of them agreed that there were women involved on the first Easter morning, but all the gospel writers have a different list of women. Then there was the appearance of the risen Jesus on the road to Emmaus, where he was not recognized at first, but only later. And then the commissioning of the disciples in chapter 24, verses 36 through 53. Notice that all of the gospel writers agree that at the end of Jesus's earthly life, he commissioned his disciples, and they all give their own distinctive accounts of that commissioning. We're going to look now at the Gospel of John, the Passion narrative in the Gospel of John. And I realize I've been going on pretty long here. So let's see if we can speed through this some. Whereas John's Gospel, as we have seen, is so different from the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in so many ways. Here in the Passion narrative, John's Gospel is more similar than at any other point in the story of Jesus. There was the anointing at Bethany in chapter 12. And notice that John says that this was Mary. John names the woman who poured out the costly ointment. And that's in chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. Then John's account of Palm Sunday. And then Jesus's public ministry concludes in John's Gospel. And then John gives us a very distinctive version of the Last Supper. No mention of what we would now call the Lord's Supper. The Last Supper is a Passover meal in John's Gospel. There is some distinctiveness in the way that John dates the Passover meal and the death of Jesus. We talked about that when we talked about John's Gospel. As I mentioned, we also see in chapter 13 the absence of the institution of what we now call the Lord's Supper in John. John gives us no version of that, but instead, the way John kind of gets at that is symbolically. After the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6, John uses language to kind of foreshadow the Lord's Supper in chapter 6. So go back and read chapter 6 and read that account in the light of what you remember about the Lord's Supper as presented by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And you'll see that John tells that differently. John is the only gospel that gives us an accounting of the washing of the disciples' feet in the upper room after supper. And John's account of Judas's betrayal is really a beautifully ominous portrayal in chapter 13, verses 21 through 30. And let's just read those verses. When Jesus had thus spoken, he was troubled in spirit and testified, "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." And the disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. And one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was lying close to the breast of Jesus. So Simon Peter beckoned to him and said, "Tell us who it is of whom he speaks." So lying thus close to the breast of Jesus, he said to him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I shall give this morsel when I have dipped it." So when he dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas. As I might have mentioned when we talked about the Gospel of John, this seemed to be an act of hospitality to Judas. It was an Oriental custom to dip the bread and to give it. And then it would have been an Oriental custom for Judas to reciprocate. But notice that Judas did not reciprocate. Some New Testament interpreters believe this was Jesus's way of offering Judas a way out, and Judas did not take it, because it was verse 27, after the morsel incident, that Satan entered into Judas. And then John says, after receiving the morsel, Judas immediately went out. This is verse 30, and it was night. That is so typical of the way John communicates. He uses a very simple image of night to talk about more than just the time of day, but to talk about the darkness and the ominous quality of that moment when Judas went out to betray Jesus. In chapters 13 and 14, Jesus discussed with his disciples at great length that he would be leaving them and he would be returning to them. He gives them the so-called new commandment. Only in John's gospel do we find this, the new commandment, in verses 31 through 35, that they love one another. And it's really that word commandment, which that is the reason why we call that Thursday night Maundy Thursday. The word commandment comes from the Latin word mandatum, which means commandment. Jesus said, "I'm giving you a new commandment, that you love one another." Now that commandment itself was not new. What made it new was Jesus said, "Love one another as I have loved you." Now I have fully shown you what it means to love each other. So you love each other the way I have loved you. That's what makes the commandment new. Then Jesus has his discussion with Peter. He has a discussion with Thomas, who says, "Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way?" And that gives Jesus the occasion to say, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me." And then Jesus has a discussion with Philip, who says, show us the Father and we will be satisfied. And then Jesus's discussion with Judas, the other Judas, verses 15 through 24. And then a summary of Jesus's legacy in the closing verses of chapter 14. In chapter 15, again, this long discourse with his disciples continues as Jesus talks about the relationships of believers. First, their relationship to Jesus. They were to abide in him. Their relationship to one another. They were to love each other. And their relationship to the world. They were to be distinctive, set apart from, be separate from the world, even though they are in the world, not to be of the world. Then in chapter 17, only John gives us what has traditionally been referred to as the high priestly prayer. We sometimes think of the Lord's Prayer in the Sermon on the Mount as the Lord's Prayer. That's why we call it that. But really, the prayer in the Sermon on the Mount is more a model prayer, and the Lord's Prayer, the prayer of Jesus himself, is what is sometimes called the high priestly prayer, and it's recorded in chapter 17, verses 1 through 26. First, Jesus prayed for himself, then Jesus prayed for his disciples, and then Jesus prayed for us. It's one of the most beautiful thoughts and passages in the New Testament, where just before Jesus faces his own death, he prays for his current disciples, but then he prayed for future believers, which would be us. Jesus prayed for us. And then there was the arrest in chapter 18. In John's gospel, Jesus is clearly in charge. His fate, his destiny is self-chosen. And in this section, Gethsemane is not, you remember in Mark's gospel how Jesus is writhing in anguish and pain and praying, but in John's gospel, Gethsemane is just a place that is mentioned. It's not an experience of agony. Jesus is not a victim of betrayal. So in John's gospel, there is no kiss of betrayal. And then at the sound of Jesus saying, I am, his arresters fall to the ground. And if you remember all the discussion that we had when we went through John's gospel about the significance of those words, I am, you'll understand how significant those words were. And of course, in John's gospel, Jesus needs no defense from Peter or anyone else. Jesus is in control of all that is happening. And then there is the trial, according to John, the appearance before Annas and Caiaphas, the high priest and the former high priest. We've talked about the Jewish and Roman jurisdiction, that the Jews were given freedom to settle their own disputes, and only after that was Jesus handed over to the Romans. Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest, had been deposed in AD 15, but was still a leading influence, and only John mentions Annas. And then Peter's denials. And one of the interesting things about the way John tells this is, John has given us this context of Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the light of the world, and so forth. I am. And in John's gospel, Peter's denials are, I am not. I am not. I am not. Then Jesus appears before Pilate, the Roman procurator. The Jews did not want to defile themselves. Look at again in that bitter irony. After this is chapter 18, verse 28. After this, I guess that should be chapter 19, verse 28. Let's see. No, I'm sorry. It would be after, excuse me. I'm just really, oh yeah, it is chapter 18, verse 28. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium. It was early. They themselves did not enter the praetorium so that they may not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Do you see the irony in that? So they led Jesus to the house of Caiaphas, to the praetorium, precisely so that Jesus could be put to death. But they didn't want to enter the praetorium because that might render them ceremonially unclean. Do you see the irony in that? And then in chapter 19, verses 10 and 11, Pilate is almost pleading with Jesus in John's gospel, but Jesus is so much in control. And Pilate says, Do you not real? This is verse 10 of chapter 19. Do you not realize that I have the power to release you or the power to crucify you? And basically, Jesus responds in verse 11 and says, you don't have any power over me at all. And the power that you think you have has been given to you by God. You are just a pawn and do not have sense enough to know it. Jesus is in charge. No one takes his life. Jesus voluntarily gives it up. And nowhere is that more dramatically seen than in the Gospel of John. And then there is John's account of the crucifixion itself. And the synoptic sayings of Jesus from the cross are absent in John. So we don't hear Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or today you will be with me in paradise, or Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, or Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. Those sayings you find in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke. But you do find some sayings from the cross that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not give us, where Jesus turns to the beloved disciple and to his mother and says to his mother, woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. And the way John tells this story, there were 4 women and 4 soldiers. The 4 soldiers were unbelieving and the 4 women were believing. There is also a contrast between the cosmic and the personal dimensions of Jesus's ministry. So Jesus is still concerned about his biological mother. And then there is, we see that Jesus is establishing a spiritual family that transcends earthly families. And he says to John, or the beloved disciple, treat her like she is your mother. And to his mother, treat him like he is your son. Beneath the cross of Jesus, a new family is being formed because of mutual devotion to Jesus. And then John's account of the burial of Jesus, the irony of the Jews' request in chapter 31. Since it was the day of Passover, in order to prevent the bodies from remaining on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high priest, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken. In other words, they're still trying to pay attention to the letter of their religious law, and here they have just crucified the Son of God, their own Messiah. We see that Nicodemus reappears in John's narrative. Nicodemus had appeared in chapter 3, verses 1 through 21. And then we see Nicodemus showing back up in chapter 19, verse 39, who came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds in weight. And then we see John's account of the resurrection, who says Mary Magdalene was the woman who came to the tomb. And then Jesus's post-resurrection appearances. First, Mary sees the empty tomb, and then Peter and John. And then Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, and then appears to the disciples. First to the 10 disciples, Thomas was absent, and then to Thomas individually, where Thomas says, I'm not going to believe unless I see. And Jesus initiates a discussion about seeing and believing. And notice that even after his resurrection, the risen Jesus still bears the marks of his suffering. And then the purpose of the gospel is stated by John in chapter 20, verses 30 through 31. We already looked at that when we surveyed John's gospel. And then the epilogue in chapter 21, where Jesus appears to the 11 disciples by the Sea of Galilee and has that discussion with Peter, in which he gives Peter 3 opportunities to reaffirm his love for Jesus just to correspond to the 3 denials of Jesus, and denials by Peter of Jesus, which shows the grace of Jesus and the forgiveness of Jesus to restore Peter and his relationship. And then Peter shows some curiosity about the beloved disciple, and basically Jesus says, don't worry about it. This has nothing to do with you. And then John concludes with a statement of the authenticity of this gospel account, and also the selectivity of this gospel account in chapters 24 and 25. This is the disciple. This is chapter 21, verses 24 and 25. This is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things and who has written these things. And we know that his testimony is true. This is authentic. This is genuine. This is true. But there are also many other things which Jesus did, were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So these passion narratives show us the doctrine of God, specifically as it relates to the Trinity. The cry of abandonment from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That mysterious union between the Father and the Son, but also the distinctions between the Father and the Son. The prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus says, not my will, but thy will be done, and seems to distinguish between his will and the will of the Father. So the doctrine of God gets developed in mysterious ways. The doctrine of the church, completing the passion and the ministry of Jesus. The doctrine of salvation, we are saved by Jesus's life. We are saved by Jesus's death. We are saved by Jesus's resurrection. And the mind of Christ, as Paul stated in the Christ hymn in Philippians 2, 5 through 11, who Jesus, though he was in the form of God, emptied himself and became obedient even to the death of the cross. And then, of course, as we have mentioned, that mysterious interplay between divine sovereignty, that is the plan of God, human freedom, the decisions of people, and the role of Satan. How these 3 forces intersect in the story of Jesus's passion and death. Was it the plan of God? Was it the choices of human beings? Or was it the result of Satan's work? And the way the passion narratives would answer all 3 of those questions would be yes, it was all of those. Well, we're going to take a break now. And when we pick back up after Easter, if you're following along with us in real time, but next session, regardless of when you're viewing this, we're going to start looking at part 2 of the New Testament, which would be the early church. And we're going to look in our next session at the book of Acts, and specifically try to introduce the world of the New Testament after the time of the historical Jesus. I hope that you're watching this. I hope that you will continue to follow along. I would love to have conversations with you. Email me or call me and text me and let me know what you're thinking. And I'd love to have some conversations. I would at least love to know that you're watching. So at the very least, let me know if you're following along. And I hope you will be here for the next session as we start part 2 of the New Testament survey, the early church.